Hey, hello everyone. I hope that you can hear me well. It is time to start. My name is Damir Dizdarevic. I'm from company Logosoft in Sarajevo. I'm also a Microsoft MVP and a Microsoft Regional Director. I'm very happy for I was able to participate in this great initiative from the MVPs from Croatia to help people who get severely hit by these terrible earthquakes by the end of the last year. So I really hope that this effort that my fellow MVPs from Croatia did and what we as presenters do will do at least a little bit of help for these people to get to normal lives. My session today is about protecting identities with passwordless authentication. It's a kind of a pretty hot and new subject because you probably know that passwords are not secure enough for quite a long time so far. And there were several methods actually to complement passwords with some other means to authenticate users and also to enhance the password authentication with some additional elements that we generally called as a multi-factor authentication. In this session, we will go one step further and we'll actually discuss how we can eliminate passwords totally and use an authentication without passwords. At the beginning, I want to say that we are still not get there totally, and we are still not totally ready to completely eliminate passwords from our lives, but there are some very nice and interesting initiatives from many software and hardware vendors, especially from Microsoft, in a direction to use passwordless methods to authenticate users on various resources, both private resources, cloud resources, and business resources implemented on premise. So let's start. Just a second. Let's see how we can, for some reason, stop sharing, just a second. Okay, I hope it's back. Let's see how we protect identities in Azure AD in general. We will also discuss how to protect identities in a local environment in the Active Directory domain services. But since most companies today have some kind of hybrid between their local infrastructure and a cloud infrastructure, which also mean hybrid between directory service implemented on-premise and a directory service implemented in cloud, we will definitely use some features enabled in the Azure AD to protect identities both in the cloud and on the on-premise resources. So let's start with reminding ourselves, how do we protect identities in Azure AD today? There are several methods that we can use there. And on this slide, you can see some most common methods to protect identities. The conditional access is a method where we define some conditions before we actually let users sign into the resource. There are many conditions that you can define here. That condition can be a machine that user is using, that can be a place from the user is trying to sign in. That can be the security state of the machine and many other conditions that you can define before you actually complete the authentication process of the user. Azure multi-factor authentication is probably the most common one, and that's the method that adds another element of authentication process to the password. So you probably use it on your accounts that you use today. So you type your password and then you have to confirm your authentication either by providing a PIN, either by providing a code, one-time code from the authentication app, or by just confirming the authentication in the authentication app, or typing the code from the SMS, or simply answering the phone call. And that's probably today most common way to additionally protect authentication process. The Windows Hello is a technology that we get from the Windows 10 several years ago. And basically, it is also an enhancement to authentication process that is primarily using biometric and PINs. You can combine Windows Hello also with these passwordless methods, and we will discuss it a bit later. But the Windows Hello is focused on using biometrics for authentication purposes in a quite a bit different way that we have used it before. As you can probably remember, we already had in a past biometric authentication. For example, a fingerprint reader on your laptop or an external fingerprint reader. That was a biometric authentication, but only partly, because that authentication method worked in a way that when you, for example, pull your finger over the fingerprint reader, you get authenticated by your fingerprint, but the password is still typed in instead of you to your system that is authenticating you. Windows Hello doesn't use that. Windows Hello actually authenticates you by using biometric and not by using a password beyond the biometric. Passwordless approach is quite a new technology, and that's something that we will discuss here today. And privileged identity management is also a method to protect identities in the Azure AD, but in a way that we define some special protection mechanisms for privileged identities, which means accounts that have higher privileges than ordinary user. That is something that is out of the scope of this session, but I also wanted to mention it here as a method that you can protect some specific groups of accounts. Let's get a quick review of a conditional access that is pretty much common today. It works like shown on this slide. We have users, devices, location, and apps. And these can be defined as a condition. For example, which user, from which device, from which location, and from which app. And when we say from which device, we also mean the security state and the general health of that device. All these conditions are actually calculated, one or more of them, it depends on what you configure, but all these conditions are calculated, and the result of that calculation is actually a risk level. And that risk today can be low, medium, or high, based on these conditions that you define. Based on the risk, there is a real-time evaluation engine that evaluates the risk and then executes appropriate control. That control can be, okay, if the risk is low, we will allow access. If the risk is higher, we can require additional multi-factor authentication to get the resource. We can completely deny access, or we can limit access based on some subset of the resources that user needs to access. And with this conditional access, we can protect both cloud applications and on-premise applications. Of course, on-premise applications must be published by using cloud services such as application proxy or similar service that actually can use the conditional access provided by the cloud. So today, a lot of technologies provided in a Microsoft Cloud as a service can be used both on-premise and in a cloud. And that's actually the beauty of the hybrid, as I usually say that, because you can actually protect and use the full power of the cloud and the technologies from a cloud, but on on-premise resources. Of course, and on a cloud application, but that is kind of normal to expect. Regarding the Azure multi-factor authentication, which is most common one, it is available as an Azure MFA service, which is default service, and also an Azure MFA server, but only for the users that purchased the Azure MFA at least a year ago or before. Azure MFA server as an on-premise resource is not available anymore to be acquired as a license package, but you can still use it if you bought it before. I'd recommend that you move away from the Azure MFA server if you implemented that, because Microsoft will soon stop the support for that service and actually switch all multi-factor authentication to the Azure MFA. Azure MFA is a service that probably doesn't need a lot of explanation. It can be connected to the most resources and to most authenticated methods in a Microsoft ecosystem. And it works actually by adding additional element of the confirming your identity to the password authentication. You can also, for application that not support MFA, you can use the app passwords. There are not many applications that still use app passwords, but some older ones still need it. And of course, it is highly recommended to always enable MFA, at least for administrators, but also for the users with conditional access. Today, I would say that it is recommended that to enable MFA to all users in your company. There is no excuse, actually, from the today perspective, there is no excuse to let anyone actually access the company resources without using the MFA. Windows Hello for Business is like a subtype of a Windows Hello. It basically works the same way as a Windows Hello technology, but it is called Windows Hello for Business because it's focused on using Windows Hello in business environments, and especially together with the local Active Directory, the main services, or with the Azure AD. Of course, you can use it with your personal accounts also, as like Microsoft account that you are using to sign into your private computer. But in the Windows Hello for Business, we actually integrate this and manage and integrate this technology with the Active Directory and protect the user authentication to the Azure AD account, but also through the Azure AD account, as you will see later, we can use Windows Hello for Business to authenticate users both to the local Active Directory and to the Azure Active Directory. Windows Hello in general, it's based on a PIN, biometric, or a gesture, and it's verified locally with the TPM chip on your computer. TPM holds your private key and it never leaves your device, which means that the private key never goes actually to the cloud service. It's generated locally and it's verified locally, and everything that is encrypted, it is encrypted locally on your PC. There is a public key in a cloud that is used as a pair with your private key, but your private key actually never leaves the device. In the Azure Active Directory, you can find only the public key. And that's for Windows Hello for Business. I think that this technology actually can be should be seen as a complement to the existing authentication methods, but also you can understand it as a way to greatly enhance the authentication of your local accounts for the local Active Directory. And that's actually the real power of the Windows Hello for Business. It is not just to authenticate you to the Azure AD account. If you, for example, have an Azure AD and have an Office 365 or Microsoft 365 service, of course, you can use Windows Hello for Business to authenticate to these services, but much more interesting to most companies today, because most of them have the local Active Directory, is actually to use it in hybrid model. The abbreviation that you will see and hear pretty much in a future is FIDO. That stands for Fast Identity Online. It's currently in a version 2.0. And that's actually the fundamental standard for the passwordless authentication. This is something that I really want to emphasize, because this approach of a passwordless authentication that we have today, that is used by Microsoft and also many other companies, it is not based on a passwordless authentication or biometric authentication that we have seen before. It is based on a completely new standard. And that standard was accepted by the FIDO Alliance, and the FIDO Alliance actually have hundreds and hundreds of companies today that are supporting that. It works with the devices that people use every day. It is based on a public key cryptography. Mostly, in most cases, it is based on a biometrics or PIN keys that never leaves the device. And it provides a great protection against the phishing, man-in-the-middle attacks, and the replay attacks that were pretty successful in authentication processes that were using only the passwords. For example, here is the list of some FIDO Alliance members. There are many, many of them, hundreds of companies more. But even if you look on this slide, you can see that almost every big vendor from the IT world today is supporting that. And it is FIDO Alliance is here to stay, and it is actually there to provide us means with a standardized approach for the passwordless authentication for every service. This is something that I really want to reiterate here, because this is not a Microsoft technology. We are talking about implementation of the passwordless authentication for the Microsoft services in this session. But in general, FIDO Alliance provides a standard for a passwordless authentication for any service, for any directory service from the vendor that supports FIDO standard. So that means that you can use passwordless authentication based on a FIDO standard for your Amazon accounts, for your Facebook accounts, for your PayPal account, for an Apple account, or any other account. We are focusing here on accounts that are in a Microsoft Azure Active Directory, but you can also use that same approach for any other account. So if you want to know more, just type in the FIDO Alliance in your web browser and you will get the fresh list of the companies that are currently support the FIDO standard. So let's talk about the passwords. Almost everyone hates it, except the hackers, except the people who wants actually to get in your system, because the password is the weakest point. And the attackers or hackers or bad guys, you call them whatever you want, yeah, actually currently the only one who really likes passwords, because it's the only way to, the easiest, it's not the only way, but it is the easiest way to jeopardize the user identity, and by that get unauthorized access to some resources. For users, passwords are complicated, especially if they are forced to use complicated passwords, complex passwords. On the other hand, for IT admins, the passwords are pretty painful because they are not secure, and also they are spending a lot of times to solve problems with the forgotten passwords. If you force the complex password, then it will result in effect that user will forget the passwords, or will in a few weeks or few months will start using the mostly the same passwords with some minimal corrections. Or even worse, he or she will use the same complex password on several services, which is also not good. So in general, we should get rid of the passwords, or at least in a first step, enhance them with some additional authentication method. Multi-factor authentication is definitely more secure combined with the passwords, but can also be complicated to use because it requires users to have at least one more device. In most cases, it is a mobile phone. But that also can depend on effect on how you provide your authentication method on the phone. The easiest way to use this is to use some authentication app like Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator. But that requires an internet connection. For example, if the user is somewhere in the roaming and he or she doesn't have the internet connection available, he or she might not be able to go through the multi-factor authentication process. So let's try to see what should be the better way. And if we look at this graph, on the left side we have inconvenient methods. On the right side we have convenient methods. On the upside, we have high security. On the downside, we have a low security. The current solutions, the current most commonly used solution is just password, is definitely a low security. And that is some old approach. If you're using just passwords as authentication method, then you should also implement some old approach to manage passwords, because you probably know that Microsoft's recommendation today is to not change passwords anymore, to configure passwords to not expire, but use an additional method of authentication. If you're using just password, you should not follow that guideline. You should follow the old guidelines that are saying, okay, protect passwords by changing them frequently, by requiring a complex password, and everything else that we have used 20 years ago. On the other hand, we have some solutions that are pretty highly secured, which are passwords with some way of the two-factor authentication, either a security key or a token or SMS, which is highly secured, at least for today, but are also inconvenient to use. So what we actually searching for is a solution that is at the same time convenient and highly secure. And that's actually the answer. The answer to that question is actually passwordless authentication, which is based on a Windows Hello technology, sometimes on a Microsoft Authenticator app, and most commonly on the FIDO2 security keys. So you know about Windows Hello, you probably know about the Microsoft Authenticator. You might not know about security keys supported by FIDO2 standard. That will be the focus actually here. How to use these security keys to eliminate the passwords and to have them as a main method of authentication for both cloud accounts and in on-premise accounts. Security key is a pretty small device. You can on this slide you can see some pretty common model, maybe the best-selling model of the Yubico. It is pretty small. There are much smaller devices actually, the nano devices from this one, but they are too small to actually be convenient to bring with yourself. And they are based on cryptography. They are not using passwords, and they are also based on a confirming physical presence of the user, either by biometrics or by just providing a PIN or simply touching the device. How it actually works. It's based on the public key technology. As we said before, private keys are securely stored on the device. It requires a local gesture, and private keys are always bound to the single device and never shared. We will go through the authentication process a bit later. These security keys are using Windows Hello to actually provide as a base technology for the authentication. Windows Hello fully supports FIDO2 certified devices. It is available since 2016, and currently it has 9.3 cases of enterprise deployments. That's a pretty old information, actually, I think from the last year, so it's probably much more before today. The Authenticator is very popular, and Microsoft works a lot, as you probably know, to enhance the Authenticator application to actually be a central point for passwords of any kind and for authentication process of any kind. In general, today Microsoft Authenticator can be also used as your password manager, but in general, that should be primarily used as a solution for the passwordless authentication, either by providing you a code, one-time code, either by providing you a code that you should confirm when you are authenticating, or by providing a biometric verification as a multi-factor authentication element. But the Microsoft Authenticator, and you should remember that if you were understanding that in a different way, is a primarily solution for the passwordless authentication. It's available for like more than 2 years, and millions and millions of users actually using that for the passwordless sign-in, and this number is increasing every day. For the passwordless authentication with the FIDO2 security keys, we have several options. Maybe the most common ones and the ones that you can get pretty easy today are the USB or NFC keys, which are simply placed in your USB ports on your computer, or even if you have a NFC chip on your laptop, you even don't have to place it on a USB port. It's enough to simply tap the device on the NFC sensor, or you can use it as an NFC method of authentication on your mobile phone. But most of the mobile phones are supporting the NFC. Not so many laptop devices are supporting NFC so far, but this number is expanding definitely. There is also a version of the USB biometric key that at the same time provides you passwordless authentication by using the security key and also authenticates you by using the biometric on the same device. These devices are not so widely spread still. One of the most well-known vendors of the security keys is Yubico, and they are still developing their USB biometric key. There are some other vendors that already developed the USB biometric key, but they are still pretty expensive and still not so widespread. and also the NFC badge that you've probably seen before, that is used as a method to use the NFC to authenticate you. But these badges are mostly used to open the doors and to actually register yourself when you get to the workplace, rather than to use the NFC to authenticate you to the device, because, as I said, a lot of laptop devices still don't support the NFC way of communication for authenticating. So let's see how the authentication works with a FIDO2 security key to actually confirm that there is no password in this process. So the first step would be for you to sit on your computer after you provisioned your FIDO2 security key, and I will show you a bit later how to provision that. User plugs the FIDO2 security key into the computer, or just tap it on the NFC. Windows detects the FIDO2 security key, and based on the information actually from the security key, because it can get credentials from there, you can see a UPN. The Windows device sends an authentication request to the appropriate resource. In this concrete example, we are sending that authentication request to the Azure AD. In the fourth step, the Azure AD sends back the nonce that's a part of the authentication process. And in that moment, user is prompted to actually complete the gesture to unlock the private key stored in a security key. So in this moment, your security key will prompt you for something. Either it will be prompt for you to type the PIN that you defined on a device, or it will be a prompt to authenticate yourself, for example, with a fingerprint on the security key. After that, as we have seen before, your TPM chip actually unlocks your private key, and it signs the nonce, this part that gets from the Azure AD, with your private key. In this step, actually, we confirm that we are locally authenticated by our security key. Why? Because when you type your PIN or authenticate yourself with a fingerprint and unlock your private key, that process actually confirms that you are there on your computer. And when you sign it with a private key, and private key never leaves your device, as we said before, it actually provides your identity. In the seventh step, the Azure AD actually generates the primary refresh token request with the signed nonce, and it's sent to Azure AD. And Azure AD then verifies this signature. How it can verify that? Because Azure AD actually has your public key, has your key pair, one part of your key pair. So if you sign, you know how PKI works. If you sign something with your private key, then only your public key can decrypt that. So when you send the authentication request, the primary refresh token request with the signed nonce from the Azure AD, the Azure AD uses your public key to decrypt that, to verify your identity, and actually return that PRT to enable access to the cloud resources. In this last step, your computer and your user account, user profile, gets the token to access cloud resources. As you can see, there is no password anywhere. These security keys in the first version were available in July 2019, and during the year 2020, we get a lot of FIDO2 security keys, and it's currently expanding pretty fast. So let's see one short demo what we should do from the user side and from the administrator side to actually support this. Just a second. Yeah. Okay, my session expired, so I'll have to sign in again, but it doesn't matter. From the administrator side, to actually enable authentication on your Azure AD by using FIDO2 security keys, you should go to your Azure AD and then choose the authentication methods. Here, you have options to enable FIDO2 security keys. This option actually is still in preview, but it works pretty well. If you click here, you need to enable the FIDO2 security key authentication. You can also configure if you will use it for all users or some selected users. If you are going into pilot of this project, it's probably wise to go with a selected user. It provides you with the option to allow self-service setup for users, which is recommended to use because users should be provisioning these keys. Will you enforce these keys to be attested, and also to enforce some key restrictions. You can also here use the option for the Microsoft Authenticator to be used for the passwordless authentication. There's actually only a few options there just to enable it and also to target to the all users or selected users. Once you enable the FIDO2 security key authentications, users will be able to provision these keys by themselves. What they should do, they should go to mysignins.microsoft.com, select the security info option, and they will get a screen like this one. You can see here I have my phone number as an authentication, one of the authentication methods. I have an authenticator app. I have it on two of my phones, and I also have two security keys associated with my accounts. You can have security keys as much as you want, but you will probably have one or two. To add new one, you click add. You say security key. You click add here, and then I can't show it right now because I don't have any more spares of these keys. But in general, after this step, when you click here, you will be prompted to plug in your security key in your USB port and provide a PIN to protect it. It's actually very simple. By provisioning security key here, you actually don't store any any credentials except for the credentials that you are using here on this page. You are providing a PIN and you provide your additional credentials, but you can also store multiple credentials on your security key, and I will show it to you just in a second. So once we have provision key, we can see it good. We can see if it's active. We can delete it at any time, and of course, if you delete from here, it will automatically be stopped from using for authentication. So in case you use your security key, you can simply just delete it from here, and it will be disabled automatically. So no one can use it. It's also protected with the PIN, of course, and you can never use it actually with the PIN. So even if you lose it, if you have a good PIN, then it's highly unlikely that someone will be able to use it. But anyway, you should delete it from here. So from the user side, when the security key is provisioned, we will go now to the private window. So we don't have any cookies, anything. And for example, if we go to the portal, office.com, we will use we will not type in the UPN here, but we will go with the sign-in options, and we will choose to sign in with the security key. So the first step will be to enter the security key PIN. My security key is already plugged in the USB port of this laptop, so I will type in the PIN. It is highly recommended to use a PIN that is at least 6 characters or more. There is no need at this point to use some complex alphanumeric pins, because it can be locked pretty fast. So if you're using just 6 different numbers, it will be pretty good. When you unlock it, you have to touch it, so you confirm your presence, and then you choose from the list of your credentials stored here. As you can see here, I have different credentials. I even have one credentials from my brother. We tested this with this. This is my test key. So we tested to actually storing some different credentials. And you can see I have a credential from my brother from the company that he works for. I have credentials for my personal accounts. I have credentials for my VDash account on Microsoft.com. I have my credentials on my private domain, and I have a credential in my business domain. So each of these that I use, I will be authenticated without providing a password to that service. For example, I will choose this one. And I just have a question if I want to stay signed in. I will say no because I'm in private mode. But I'm signed in without providing a password to my personal Office 365 tenant. Okay, so let's get back to the presentation. What is very interesting is that FIDO2 is now expanding to the hybrid environments. And in the hybrid environments, we can use the passwordless authentication on devices that are joined to the local Active Directory domain. This is a very interesting scenario because we can have devices that are joined to both local Active Directory and to the Azure Active Directory and use the security key and passwordless authentication and single sign-on for both on-premise and cloud resources. At this moment, this is actually the most useful scenario. What we need here is actually the latest version of the Azure AD Connect, latest Windows Server build, and if you have an older version of the Windows Server, there is a patch for a passwordless authentication for the main controller for the Windows 2016 and 2019. And also, which is very important, you need to have your local AD in a hybrid synchronization mode with the Azure AD, which is probably something that you already have, but still, if you don't, you need to have that enabled before implementing this. So how authentication works here? There is a Windows 10 client locally joined to your local ADDS, hybridly joined to the Azure AD. We have a local Active Directory with the Azure AD Connect synchronized with the Azure AD, and we have a user with the security key. In the first step, user authenticates to the Azure AD with the FIDO2 security key. And that's actually the first step is the same procedure that we analyzed a few minutes ago. By providing a PIN or a gesture, decrypting the private key, so everything happens in this first step. User authenticates itself to the Azure AD by using a security key, which is okay. But since we have a device that is joined to both Azure AD and the local AD, and we also want to use the same key and the same credentials to authenticate to the local Active Directory, we have some more work to do here. Azure AD, after authenticating the user with the FIDO2 security key, checks the tenant and see if the tenant is in a hybrid with the local Active Directory. So it's actually checked if there is Azure AD Connect between this tenant and a local Active Directory. If it finds it, then it looks for the Kerberos server key matching the user's on-premise AD. It will find it because users is synchronized with Azure AD Connect. At that moment, Azure AD generates something that's called partial Kerberos ticket granting ticket. You know that we are using ticket granting tickets for local authentication on a Kerberos, but now Azure AD generates that ticket for the user on-premise AD domain. This ticket granting ticket contains only the user SID, nothing else, no authorization data groups, anything else. This partial ticket granting ticket is then returned to the Windows 10 device along with the Azure AD primary refresh token, and that primary refresh token, as you probably remember from the procedure before, is generated in the first step once the user authenticates to the Azure AD. Based on these two elements, Windows contacts the on-premise Active Directory domain controller, and actually it trades this partial ticket granting ticket for a full ticket granting ticket. Azure AD, local Active Directory will do this because it knows that is in hybrid with the Azure AD, with the single instance of the Azure AD, so it can trust the partial ticket granting ticket that it gets from the Azure AD, and that partial ticket granting ticket actually confirms to the local Active Directory that the user is authenticated. Because with the Azure AD Connect, we establish a trust between our local AD and the Azure AD. Now our local AD trusts the Azure AD, so partial ticket granting ticket is actually valid for the full ticket granting ticket locally. And in the fifth step, Windows has the fully Azure AD ticket, partial ticket granting ticket, and also a full Active Directory ticket granting ticket. Once the user gets the ticket granting ticket from the AD, local AD, it can access all resources that are managed by the local Active Directory. And it also, based on a first step, can access the resources in cloud. As you can see here, we are not using the passwords. So how it works in a practice, I have a short video that I will play here because it's a bit too complicated to demonstrate that in practice. We need several devices. So we are touching the security key. This is the first step. We are authenticating to the Azure AD. So if we type here the dsreg, you can see that this device is the Azure AD joint. It is also domain joint. And if we list the Kerberos tickets, there is only one currently. Once we simply access the office.com, like I did it before, so we access the cloud resources. And also, based on the same authentication, we access the local Active Directory. This is the domain controller. So since we access the domain controller without using a password, we are definitely authenticated. And if we repeat the key list, we will see the tickets for all resources that we actually access without typing a password, not a single time. Okay, let's go. So how do we force security key logon on a Windows 10? It's pretty simple. If you want to enforce authentication for the Windows 10 devices only with the security key, so it authenticates you to both Azure AD resources and resources in your local infrastructure, you should play a bit with the group policy. Go to the computer configuration, expand administrative templates, then expand system, and go to the logon options. The last logon option here is called turn on security key sign in. You should enable this one. And besides that, you should also exclude the credential providers that you don't want to use. This is mandatory step to use because if you only do this one, you will enable users to use security key to sign in locally, but you will also leave them all other methods to sign in, like pins, passwords, or anything else that was enabled before. If you want to enforce authentication only with the security key, you should do this. Go to the option called exclude credential providers, and then list the credential providers that you don't want to use. This is actually the list of these credential providers here that want to use. So it's pretty cryptic. So you're probably asking yourself how to know what to type here. I provided a list of the credential providers for Windows, and you can use this list from this presentation to actually use that. As you can see from this slide, I bolded it here. The password provider ID, CLS ID is here, and we use that one here to actually disable the passwords. So this example shows how we disable the passwords for as excluded credential provider and use only the security key, but you can also disable any other that you want. So this is some kind of Microsoft passwordless journey. Before we wrap up this session, you should deploy passwordless replacement offering, reduce user visible password surface area, transition to passwordless method, and eliminate passwords from your identity directory. To be able to do that, this is something you must have. So you need to have a presence in the Azure AD. This, in technical meaning, this means that you need to have synchronization between your local AD and the Azure AD. Without the presence of the user accounts, not passwords, but only user accounts in the Azure AD, you can't do anything that I showed. So you should also enable the Azure MFA. You should update your applications to modern authentication. This is very important. You should be ready with capable hardware, register new credential, security key, and use them. For the end, I provided some roadmap planning. I will show the full screen here, so it is mostly for you to have as a reminder. What are the credential management tasks? So multi-factor authentication, true single sign-on, Windows Hello for Business, passwordless credentials, and improving the password management, and the things you can do now, next 3 months, next calendar year, and looking beyond. So it's a kind of review of how you can plan your roadmap to switching to the passwordless authentication. Okay, so time is up. If you have questions, I'm here and we'll be happy to answer. Okay, seems like
can I just jump in, Damir,
sure.
Just one short question. How that looks from the user sides if you compare with the passwords, and as you mentioned in the beginning, in the beginning that is complicated with using MFI, taking mobiles and everything. How that looks from the user side perspective, passwordless, and did you have any experience from that side?
Yeah, actually, we had in a company that I'm running, we had a very big client that fully implemented the security keys with a passwordless authentication, and it went very smoothly. And actually, it went much better than I expected. So the user training was pretty minimal. They accepted it very well because it is extremely simply to use. Of course, they should remember to have their security keys with themselves, but once they have it and once they provision it, which is also a very simple procedure, it is super simple to use that actually. And if they have laptops with the NFC, they don't even have to plug it in the USB port. They just have to tap it on a laptop and enter the PIN. So our experience so far is very positive. Okay. So if there are no other questions, thank you for your attention. Thank you very much for supporting this initiative. The organizers already probably told you what the donations will be used for. So thank you very much. I was very glad to participate in this. I hope you enjoyed this session and have a nice day.
Thank you, Damir. You answered Juro questions in chat, yeah?
We have... no, I didn't see it, sorry.
So sorry, can we generally disable password and say for a particular user, password is allowed for this particular user? You can read it.
Yeah, I've seen it now. Actually, yes, you can. By using this group policy that I've shown you, you can actually apply this group policy with disabling a password only for some specific group of user, for some specific organizational unit. So yes, you can diverse users if you have some users that want to that you want to have enforced security keys, and some users that are still need to be able to use passwords. Yes, it is possible to do.
Ok. Hvala puno još jedanput, evo sad na hrvatskom. Hvala svima i idemo dalje sa prezentacijama i pridružite se na Ask the Expert, of course. Hvala.
Hvala Tomislav, hvala svima na prisustvu.